Sorry.
Dalawa na lang kami na umattend nung panel na yon.
Okay.
Okay, it's streaming live.
Yeah, we're going live.
So we have participants from different universities in Metro Manila and also in the provinces. So we also have officers from the government, different government offices, and of course our students in MTSDEP.
So can I go?
Yes.
Yes, ma'am.
Go now? All right. Oh,
yes.
Good afternoon, everyone who are joining this very interesting panel on whose knowledge, ethical issues in participatory research with the urban poor. That issue is becoming more and more important, certainly among academics who find that it's sort of more convenient in a way for them to do research in urban settings because we tend to live in urban settings, but because the issues of poverty in rural and urban areas are becoming greater and greater. Of course, with COVID-19, that issue has really come to the fore in showing the social inequalities in the country and how both the rural and urban poor are the ones most affected. So it's really timely that people who have done significant research with the urban poor in very engaged ways, participating with them or together in deriving knowledge which is based locally from the people and shared. But then realizing, as those of us who do that kind of participatory research, begin to get a little bit concerned about how far can we go? Are we going too far? Are we undermining the very purpose for which we're there, which is to enable people's voices to be heard? You know, what does it take to do that right, if there is such a thing as the right way? There is no right way, but what are we learning in the process of being involved in those kinds of research involvement? So we're very glad to have our regular students here as well as additional people from all over the country. Let me then introduce our two main presenters. Our first one will be Dr. Carinnes Alejandria, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Sociology at University of Santo Tomas, Manila. Her special area of interest is health inequalities, and she is in fact the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Social Health. So you will understand why there are several articles on the Philippines there, because those who are doing that kind of research find this journal as a very appropriate one for them to publish and make their ideas known and meet others who are in the same area of interest. We first met when she was doing her dissertation in Baseco, and I have often been in Baseco, but I noticed something different about her from all other researchers of Baseco, and that was that she was focusing on older persons. Usually they're left out of the equation. Even in the communities, they're somewhat marginalized because you have poverty, you know, across all age groups. So this is why we particularly asked her to join this, because of her direct experience, her interest in health, which is a key concern now, and as an academic, but also how does an academic become an engaged academic, right? Or engaged anthropologist? What was that process? You know, where were you coming from? You will find some of this written. She has published in 2 books, which are out, all about aging and Disaster Archipelago, if you want to know more. So that will be, our first speaker will be Dr. Carinnes Alejandria, and our second speaker will be Dr. Chester Arcelia, who is an assistant professor of economics at the University of the Philippines in Manila. And that is definitely different from UP in Quezon City, as they will tell you in case you ever confuse them. It's interesting, he really comes, he's initially an economist who got very concerned with what about the social side, because economists tend not to look too much at that. And so he also enrolled in sociology, and you can call him also a sociologist. There are not that many who have that kind of combination academically, but happily he's one. He's interested in the political economy. So by bringing in sociology and anthropology to make a dent on the thinking on it, plus his being based with community groups, particularly in Quezon City, which he will tell you about. He's particularly interested in what he calls the counter history of incremental home and community building. Well, he can explain that to you. And his article, our students have read, or should have read, his article on urban subaltern. So maybe when he comes on, I'll just ask him first to explain what is that word subaltern? Where does it come from? And in his article, why does he use it? Doesn't ever say the urban poor, which is a standard frame. Why are these things changing? Just as Dr. Carinnes no longer says elderly or older persons, but speaks of older adults. So in this kind of research with people, even the categories are changing, trying to express what is a more realistic way of understanding people in certain categories and what is their own view of themselves and what the significance of it is. So we will have, each of them will present in about 20 minutes each, and then we will open the floor to questions and answers. And you can direct those either to both or one, as you wish. It should be placed on the chat, and Dr. Caraos and Dr. Melissa Navarra, who are facilitating this also, will be going through the questions, trying to group them for maximum involvement with our panelists. So let me then turn to Dr. Carinnes, if you would start.
Thank you, Prof. Mary, for the generous introduction. I will now share my presentation. Okay, I hope that you can see it.
Yes, all right, good, it's there.
Okay, so I've entitled this presentation as Reflections on Ethical Approaches in Participatory Research, the case of Baseco Compound. I have been, sorry, I think I'm, okay. So I have been working in Baseco for, sorry, there we go. There are subtitles. So I've been working in Baseco for the past 7 years. I started sometime in 2012. My initial objective in doing so was to look into how people from a place that is considered as a hazard zone have decided to make it their residence, and how are they coping with this, I thought was a daily form of disaster. So for those of you who are not aware where Baseco Compound is, it is actually this 52 hectares of a land in Manila. It's also called the port area because it's literally beside Baseco Port Authority, which is one of the oldest port in Metro Manila. So Baseco is made up of recycled, it's a reclamation area. It didn't exist before that. This patch of land, I don't know if you can see my cursor moving, but this patch of land that you're seeing, this triangle of a land, did not exist prior to 1970s. It was because of the constant usage of garbage, broken shells, and soil that people kept on reclaiming the water to become their home base. Right now, there's about 60 to 70,000 residents in Baseco. So we just say about because there's not there is no formal census that could account for the very fluid population that we have in this area. People keep on coming in and then moving out. That's how this place could be described in terms of population. We have there are several blocks in this area, and Professor Mary has worked a long time in this area. And for me, I have worked along this area near Manila Bay. I'm sorry, Manila Bay. So it's bordered by Manila Bay and Pasig River. So it's an estuarial community, meaning the meeting of salt water and fresh water. So because of that, it has a very interesting ecosystem as well. So anyway, this place, because it's a reclaimed land, has become very it's declared as a hazard zone, because every time there's a shift in weather or shift in tidal in tides, then there would immediately be a form of flooding in the area. When I started working here, flooding was a constant. I knew for a fact that I have to bring in my boots. I have to always be on guard for flooding. And sometimes flood will not go away for like weeks. And so people have been used to that. So that being said, what were my goals in doing this project? What were my goals? What were my roles? I went there with the aim of looking into disaster, which later evolved into food security among older adults. I thought that the main issue that would really capture my attention was that of disaster. But it did, and a book was launched because of that. But I also saw that more than disaster, there is a day-to-day issue that haunts every household there, and that was food security. There is massive chronic hunger happening in the households of Baseco Compound. And to think that most of the households are led by older adults, meaning people age 55 onwards, and they are led by older adults. Mostly the households are consisted just with an older adult and the grandchildren. Because the middle generation is missing. The middle generation, which are the moms and dads of those children, are working or having a different life outside of Baseco. So the children are left with the grandparents. So this kind of scenario made me very interested in how are these types of households navigating issues of food, issues of allocation of resources. And so my major role when I got to Baseco in 2012 was to become an ethnographer. That was just my role. And being a faculty member at the University of Santo Tomas, another part of this role was to make sure that I mentor students to become ethnographers as well, looking into the same issues and such. And so I've gone through that kind of role for about 2 years. I was following the very classic version of objectivity. I was just looking into the variables or the context that I was exploring until I met this boy. Some of my former students would remember this. Back in 2014, I met this young boy who I was just walking around the field, the community, and there was a Lola, a grandmother, and the grandmother was carrying this boy, and he had like enlarged testicles, and I was curious, what are they going to do about that situation? And the grandmother was saying to me that, they didn't have much to go on with, and that there is not much that they can do about the situation. So they're just letting it be. The boy also had asthma. In short, the boy was plagued with a lot of health issues. And it was early in the morning, and I myself at that time had a 2-year-old boy, and I was thinking, no, 1-year-old boy. I was thinking, what, I would never allow my child to go through this kind of situation. And looking at the helplessness of the grandmother, I'm thinking there must be something that I could do to change the situation. And so that, I think, was the start of me getting ethical entanglements in the field, because I was supposed to be there to objectively um, document culture, document day-to-day lives of these people. But at that moment, I realized that that was not going to be my role anymore, and I have to break several protocols. And so um, intervention became a key part of my research engagement in the community. And probably it's also the reason why it took quite a long time for me to complete that my dissertation, because it just kept on evolving from data collection to becoming more like an intervention process. And so research was there, mentoring was there, but intervention was also key in that, in my community engagement in Baseco Compound. And this being said, one issue came about, and that was another layer of power struggle. So you see, when I got to Baseco, of course, there's already the power dynamics. I'm this scholar from a big university in Manila that they know of, and maybe I can bring something for them, but of course, that was not happening at that time. But now that I'm creating active intervention projects in the community, the power dynamics became stronger. From just being this regular researcher that they see going around, suddenly I'm this person who can bring about some change in the community, which was a very difficult role to keep up, and which is a role that I did not intentionally want as a researcher. But for quite some time, it was a day-to-day struggle that I had to navigate as a researcher, and at the same time as a partner for development in these communities. So the question that I was trying to answer at that time that I met this boy was, when do I stop being a stranger? When do I stop being a stranger? Just like in the abstract that I've shared with you, it comes from that classic question of Powdermaker asking about being a stranger at the same time being a friend as an ethnographer. What exactly is my role here when I am considered a stranger, not really part of the community, but at the same time I am now their friend because I care for them, I bring support for them, and I'm now the godmother of several kids in that area. Am I still a stranger? Am I now a friend? Where do I position myself as a researcher? And how can I maintain my objectivity? So these were the ethical entanglements that I have faced. This photo that you're seeing is me seeing him again after 4 years. So after 4 years, because of the time that I intervened, medically intervened in his health crisis, I met him in another medical mission that I've organized with my students and with the University of Santo Tomas. And his Lola, the grandmother, came up to me and said, "Ma'am, do you remember this boy? This was the boy that you helped several years back." And I'm thinking, wow, it's been 4 years. And I've just been so very busy with my community interventions. And my research is also there, but it has become, the intervention became the primary role that I was engaged with, not the research. So these were the types of dilemma that I faced working with a community. Now, as I moved along in this quiet um, this quite multiple layered type of relationship, I began to realize that there must be better ways that I could engage with them. So literature has proven that so many literatures have discussed how we could break that cycle of power dynamics, power struggle between the researcher and the community members. And so several years back, we through the help of my department chair, Dr. Batan, who's a sociologist, we have started engaging the community to have to narrate their own voices, to be more active in the retelling of their narratives. And so some of the pictures you're seeing here is from an international fellowship that Brown University organized here in the Philippines. And instead of just me telling the participants, the fellows, that, okay, this is Baseco, this is what we do in Baseco, this is how they experience disaster and whatnot, we made them talk about their experiences. We made them make sense of their experiences. And this, I think, was a very empowering moment for them. This young boy that you're seeing in the photo is the son of my collaborator, Ate Marie, and his name is Michael. And I see how his view of his community is shifting. I see how his vision of the future for him and his community is shifting because of these engagements that he is having. Because at one time, I remember I was speaking about their community, and I said something that I thought was truth, because that's what I saw, that's what observed and whatnot. And then he corrected me and said, no, actually, that thing that you saw, it wasn't that. This is what happened. And so the relationship was being reshaped as time went on in my engagement with them. From them being passive voices that I narrate in public, although that's happening right now, of course. I gave them a link to this. I don't know if they're even watching, and plus it's in English. But anyway, from being passive listeners to stories of them being told, they have become active participants in the telling of their stories. Another thing that shifted in my relationship with them was that they became active collaborators in the data collection process. So they're not just the key informants now, they are now translators, they are now data collectors, and so they become part of our research projects. They get paid for it, they get recognized for it. I think our greatest dream as a team is to have what Professor Mary has done for her collaborators, wherein they publish together. I think I hope that we can get to that time that we could publish together. But whenever I have publication that's out for public, I would consult with them that this is what I'm saying in this paper. Is this correct? Do you agree with it? And so in this other picture that you're seeing, standing beside me is Ate Marie, the president, and the other members of the organization. I'm holding the book on Disaster Archipelago, and I was showing to them that this is the book about Baseco. A part of it, actually. It's about Baseco. These are the stories that he told me. These are the stories of our older adults that they've shared with me. Now, how about me? How did me and my teammates in USD, how are we reshaping our relationship with the community? Because of this collaborative process that we already have with the community members, the researches that we create in the area became a bit more targeted. Since the area is plagued with health issues, from food security to tuberculosis, and now even COVID is one one of the biggest threats in the community, because if you think about it, space is a luxury that space is a luxury that they don't have. And so getting the virus, getting infected by it because of proximity to another person is very high in this area. So we create targeted researches, and these targeted researches are addressing key health issues in the community, hoping that by learning more about the localized ideas about health, and hoping that by understanding how they understand illnesses and um, illnesses and um, um, illnesses and what do you call this? Medication towards these illnesses. We're hoping that we could create a better way of engaging them, of making them access the health system better, or vis-a-vis, or vice versa, that the healthcare system that we have could have a better way of addressing the needs of the vulnerable sector. Then another part of our engagement in the community is that of making the effort to engage institutions. What you're seeing here is the first time that older, so what we have tried to help organize in Baseco Compound through the help of the Simbahayan office of the University of Santo Tomas is that of creating an organization for this area in Baseco. Prof. Mary is leading is a key person for another organization in Baseco, but these women are not part of that. So we needed to create a group for them, specifically for them, for women who are older adults, women who are key players in the key economic players in their households, women who get abused and such. So these women have decided to create an organization, but they did not know how to register themselves. They did not know how to get funding. And so this is where institutions came in. And as a researcher, it became my role to bridge the connection between the community members, in this case, the women, and an institution that could possibly help them financially to start their projects and to facilitate their registration, in this case, through the Department of Trade and Industry. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that the role of the researcher in this context of working in heavily marginalized areas like Baseco Compound is that apart from engaging with them, making them active participants of the telling of their narratives, was to also engage them with institutions that could help them achieve the goals that they've set for themselves. Now, another part that I have been thinking about lately is that of another ethical concern that I'm facing is that of when do my collaborators, my community partners, when do they finally break free from this feelings of power dynamics with me? Because for me, it is clear that I do it every day, that I tell them we're equal, we're partners, you're my students, mentors whenever they're in the field. And they do that, they teach them. They've graduated 3 generations of sociology students from UST. But the problem is that the way that they interact with me still has still reminiscent of the power dynamics that started our relationship to begin with. Even the older adults who remain today, who are still alive today, because having worked there for 8 years, I've lost so many key informants mostly due to hunger and related diseases. Though even the older adults do not treat me as a young person, they still treat me with some degree of power. And even if tell them to call me Carinnes, they still want to call me ma'am. Even if they created their own organization, a registered organization, I would still get messages from them asking me if I'm okay that they're going to start this particular project. And so I have to keep on reminding them that no, this is not a decision that I have to make. This is a decision that we have to make as an organization. So there is that it is very important to be consistent on a day-to-day basis that I interact with them. And now that even now that we have COVID, we get to interact on a daily basis because of the projects that we have in the area. We need to be consistent in how we implement protocols for self-determination, because most of the time that becomes an issue for the community members. I'd like to show this. I'd like to end my discussion with this set of photos. This, I think, is one of the surprises, and one of the markers of self-determination that I've seen for the women of Baseco. The samahan ng nagkakaisang kababaihan ng Baseco is mostly consisted of older adult women who are leaders of their households. Although the leadership of the women's organization is mostly consisted by middle-aged women, the membership is mostly consisted with older adult women. And several days ago, they messaged me and said, ma'am, see, there's still the ma'am. Ma'am, we are thinking that instead of saving our money, because they have some funds that they got from their livelihood activity, instead of saving our money, can we use that money to feed the children of households that are experiencing extreme food insecurity right now? And these are the households of the grandparents, older adults, led by older adults. And so I had to tell them, why are you consulting me if I'm okay with it? It's your money, it's your organization. I'm just here to support you. Should you need any financial help or any connection that you want? And they said, oh, we just want to check if this idea is if this is a good idea. And at that moment, I'm thinking, even though there are still gaps in the self-determination aspect, that was the most independent statement I've heard from my collaborators in the field for the 8 years that I have worked with them, to decide for themselves that this is a project that we saw is very important, and that we want to do it on our own with the money that we have. And I think that this is how an anthropologist like myself, who initially came to the field to do ethnographic work, has shifted my role into becoming an engaged anthropologist. And so I'd like to end my sharing, my reflection with an iteration of our role as anthropologists, as ethnographers, or as development workers. We often go to the field with all these ethical considerations because we came from ethics regulatory committees that said that these are the extent of your engagement in the community. But when you get into the community, and most specifically, when you go to communities in global South settings, wherein poverty is a key determinant of daily life, those ethical considerations need to be revisited. They need to be recalibrated, because as you live with them, as you stay with them in the field, you realize that the science that we work with, although very important, needs to be tempered with engagement, needs to be tempered with our value for humanity. Because at the end of the day, isn't it that what we aim for in all of this work that we have is to achieve justice? That's it for me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carinnes, for a very enlightening and inspiring presentation, and a very practical one too. Let me just remind the students that in our previous webinar with Dr. Kanudai, one of the things he kept emphasizing as an anthropologist is people are human beings. We are human. You don't forget that, you know, so you have to reorganize your roles in that way. When you're in the field or in their place, talking to them as their guest in a way. All right, now I'm very happy that we can now turn to Dr. Chester Arcelia, who is sharing his screen.
Okay. Oh, what just happened?
Okay, we have you.
Okay, can you see me?
Yes, yes.
Okay, let me just... Okay. Magandang gabi po. Good evening. Right. So thank you to Mom Mary for inviting me to share my experiences in the field. So I've entitled my discussion, "Whose Knowledge, Whose Risk, Whose Benefits?" Right. So what I want to do in the 20 minutes that is allotted to me is to raise questions and initiate a critical discussion of how knowledge production is implicated with ethical considerations. How and for whom do we weigh risk and benefits co-constitutes our political involvement and the knowledge that we generate. Right? So I draw from my field work with urban poor struggles, urban subaltern struggles for the right to adequate housing. At the onset, let me answer Dr. Mary's question. Subaltern is a term that refers to the marginalized and the silenced. Right? The silenced is a key term. They are indeed poor. The subalterns are indeed poor, but they're also not treated as citizens, right? So when we say urban poor, we reduce the entire concept of marginality to something that's material, often income-based, right? So I use the term subaltern to widen the scope of marginality and include how they're treated within government, within housing practices. So let me share my field work, my field site. Those who are living in Metro Manila are very familiar with this. This is a Quezon City Circle, right? And this is the slum, Sitio San Roque, that I work with since 2012, right? And it's at the back of Trinoma Mall. Right? Trinoma Mall used to be part of the slum, right? So it looks like this now, right? So it's going to be turned as a part of a Quezon City Central Business District, similar to something like Makati or the Fourth. And you can now see the high-rise buildings along EDSA, right? So the aim of the Central Business District is to generate investments in high-end real estate, medical tourism. That's why it includes, the project includes part of East Avenue and the public hospitals there, including Lung Center, the Philippine Health Center, East Avenue Medical Center, and also as a site for call centers. Right? So I lived in the slum for a while, right? My research is, in a sense, it's unique in the sense that I went to the field because I was already an activist. I went to the field because I wanted to be engaged, right? So at the onset, that was clear for me, right? But I was not ready for the sense of radicality that was in the community, right? So in 2014, the community engaged in barricade. Let me show you a couple of pictures so that you better understand what it means, right? So this is a barricade. This is a residents of the community trying to defend their homes from forced evictions. These are called feces bombs. Sa Tagalog, tae bombs. These are plastics that contain human excrement, fish innards, liquid taken from drains. They're very smelly. Right? they're thrown into the police. The police, of course, retaliates with these are tear gas, right? And they bring with them a demolition crew, also from urban poor communities. Community activists would lie down on the road to prevent them from entering the community, and they would, tell the public through a media briefing of what's happening, right? At the end of the day, several activists are arrested, right? So this is my field site, right? So let me just read that. So during that barricade, 11 activists were arrested. Many slum residents, however, who accessed state funding for better relocation did not support the resistance. Some called the activists troublemakers, even as they themselves participated in an earlier community barricade. Some families went about their everyday lives, seemingly undisturbed by the forced evictions and radical resistance. So my reflections are coming from a situation of conflict, right? And I'm basically asking this question: up to what extent can we as engaged ethnographers or development workers participate in these enactments, or which enactments, in our attempt to understand grassroots realities and support the struggle for the right to adequate housing? Right? So this is the basic question, right? So let me situate it within the context of what's happening to cities in the global South, right? The struggle for adequate housing is going to become a critical struggle for a lot of urban subalterns in the global South, right? And it's happening not just in the Philippines, it's happening everywhere in the globe, right? And in 2011, for instance, the UN Habitat said that forced evictions are a global crisis, and that around 1.5 billion in 2000 were 1.5 billion people were forcibly evicted. In the Philippines, the Presidential Commission on the Urban Poor reports that 620,000 families are evicted from 2008 to 2016. So in a span of 8 years, that's around 3 million people evicted from their homes, right? My point is that, and this is a contribution to the urban poor struggle, is that forced evictions and demolition are increasingly becoming normal within city development. Right? So just the other week, there was a demolition in Laguna, despite the COVID pandemic. Right? So why are the poor resisting demolitions? Because slums, or squatters as we refer to them in the local dialect, are pro-poor communities and economies that have been built over long periods slowly by the poor. But these are constructed often by the state as illegal and dystopian, something that needs to be eliminated. One of my respondents said that, dito lang po kami tinatanggap bilang tao. It is only in the slum that we are accepted as human beings. So for the urban subaltern, the struggle for the right to adequate housing is a struggle for their right to live and survive. So let me go to my ethical reflections. Our work as researchers, or even as development workers, is to frame how things are being understood, right? And hopefully we can make some dent in policy making and how people view certain realities and make things better. And as Carinnes have said, it's towards social justice, right? The problem is when you immerse in a site of conflict, right? Like the struggle for the right to adequate housing, it's not a straightforward affair, right? It's not just that you engage with the poor. It has to be in a manner that's sustainable for you as an academic and as a researcher. There are certain risks to these engagements. And what I want to do now is go through 4 basic points about these risks and how these risks implicate knowledge production. Right. One is that the forced evictions are often pushed for by the state and elites, right? So when you engage with the poor in their right for adequate housing, there's a risk of what a scholar would say, that there's a withdrawal of offending academic citizenship rights, which means that you become target of the exclusions of the state and the elites, right? At the most subtle, there's closure to access to information, right? In my research, I often found it difficult to get data from certain government agencies, or accessing for interviews real estate developers, for instance, right? So this leads to a neglect of the powerful and the privileged. But their story is very critical to understanding urban marginality, or marginality in general. Right? Now, one of the more serious ethical dilemmas I had in the field was when data is given to you as a researcher, and it's only for research purposes only. Do you reveal that data to the affected public? Right. So what does it mean when when data is only for research purposes only? Right. Can you reveal it to the urban poor whose lives are at risk from state policy? Right. So this is something that we need to think about. Who owns the data to begin with? Isn't that data public to begin with? Why is that data not accessible to urban poor? Why is it accessible to me simply because I'm a university professor? Let me go to the second ethical consideration. Right? When we go to the urban poor communities, there's a tendency among a lot of scholars to homogenize communities, right? Which means that we tend to look at poverty as something that's homogeneous, right? Well, when you really live in urban poor communities, you begin to realize that they're heterogeneous, and in their struggle for better lives, they often compete with each other, and that organizations are not very friendly to each other sometimes, right? And there's a debate, there's a competition that exists within the community among grassroots organizations, right? So when a scholar goes into that kind of site, right, and the scholar bears certain resources, certain access to data, certain funding, right, a capacity to have them be better listened to the general public, which particular organization do you privilege? So I remember one time in my fieldwork, I was in a protest march with a very radical group. And one of the community members pulled me aside and said that, why are you joining that protest? And it dawned on me that particular woman did have problems with the particular group that I was joining. And she thought that it was too radical. Right? So now when we if we try to equalize our resources so that competing organizations can access us as scholars, right? There's a consequence to knowledge that we can get in the community, right? When that knowledge requires very deep trust, when that knowledge requires access to meetings that may be viewed as not entirely open, right? If we want access to life histories, right, we need to privilege certain organizations, certain personalities, right? So that tends to exclude other organizations, right? But that's very critical to gaining trust within communities, right? Now, that political participation for me was very critical in trying to influence or trying to contribute better to the politics on the ground. Right? Sometime after 2012, right, the community was faced with a legal battle in their struggle for adequate housing. against forced eviction, right? But the group that I was working with, the Kalipunan ng Damayang Mahirap, it's much more popular as a radical group, right? Was not very well versed in legal issues. It did not know housing protocols very well. So I had to shift my study to looking at urban planning and housing protocols. And we studied these together, right? But because I was already viewed as somebody they could trust, they internalized the data and the information. And that internalization, that better information, actually led to the delay of a demolition of another slum community that Kadame was helping, right? So my engagement with the community, in a sense, allowed another community to exist one more year in their sight, right? Of course, privileging particular organizations or particular politics or particular groups comes with an epistemological consequence, right? It means that we privilege a particular representation, right? Let me just read it. This one is very academic and I apologize for that. The representations we write as engaged ethnographers must be viewed as part of a larger story, a complex subaltern history in construction and of struggle, situated in changing neoliberal government rationalities and techniques. In this subaltern history, the subjects have dynamic, fragmented, sometimes ambiguous, but no less politically significant identities, right? My point being is that the stories we write are simply part of a larger story, right? And we need to be cognizant that other stories exist, right? And we must invite those stories to create a better understanding what's happening on the ground. Let me go to my third point, right? I've already mentioned that urban poor communities are messy, right? There are layers of vulnerabilities. There are layers of differential citizenships among urban poor families, right? One of those layers in terms of housing is that homeless and renters are often neglected, both by the state in terms of financial assistance and relocation privileges. Right? Why is that? Because the state is interested in clearing a particular site. So if you do not have a shanty or you're not a co-owner of a shanty for clearing, the state doesn't offer you the same privileges as owners and co-owners. Right? So the homeless and the renters are often the most marginalized in the community. Right? Of course, that's not recognizing the other aspects of vulnerabilities like age and gender. But in terms of housing, the homeless and the renters are the most marginalized. Now, because I was already viewed as part of the community, right? And people shared my politics and I shared their politics at the grassroots level. I was able to introduce the People's Plan as a tool of resistance. Now, those who are very familiar with urban poor politics would know that Kadamay is a very radical group and is not very versed with state engagement. And the People's Plan as a technology of grassroots organizing has been developed by groups that are not so red, let me say that. Right? So there was a very long debate if we should be using People's Plan as a tool of resistance, right? And I remember that debate lasted for 3 or 4 years, right? Eventually, we developed what is called the Community Development Plan. And the Community Development Plan included renters, homeless, and the elderly. Those families that the state would often neglect, right? We also asserted that payment should be socialized based on capacity to pay, right? So this is an on-site proposal. Politically, it's going to be an uphill battle whether this is going to be successful in the future. So it's a wait and see. But the point is that because I was viewed as somebody, as an insider in a political organization, I was able to introduce tools that were developed by other urban poor groups that would not have entered the debate of much more radical groups. the last part is really being cognizant of time frames. Our concept of time as university students or faculty, or as development workers or our researchers, is very much different from the concept of time for those who are struggling on the ground. Their struggle is very long. It would last for decades. Our research would last for months, maybe 1 to 2 years. Right? So recognition of the timelines is very important if we're to recognize that we have differential capacities. Our capacities to understand and access data is very much different from the way community and grassroots leaders would think about strategies and collect data and understand that data. And so even well-intended academic interventions sometimes fail to understand these legal, economic, and political prerequisites. Right? So in my article, there's an example I cite there where a particular class went into the community and offered drawings of on-site buildings. Right? So the on-site buildings were not based on actual research. They were very good representations of imaginations of students who were very friendly to the community, but they did not recognize that the community need to learn how to engage the state, how to source funds, how to compute how much this is going to cost, how the struggle is going to take, and so on and so forth. Right? So eventually, those drawings were not very useful. So my point is, like what Carinnes has said, we need to reframe and be open to the lengthening of research. Right? So in my particular research, I scaled up my research from understanding subaltern politics to looking at urban planning and housing protocols in general. Right? So that delayed my research for 3 or 4 years. So those who know me, it took me a really long time to finish my research. Right? In order to make our engagement sustainable and like what Dr. Carinnes has mentioned, we need to find institutional openings within our universities or within the spaces where we work so that the urban poor or the urban subaltern can access this in a way that's sustainable and accountable. Right? So a particular individual will find sustaining his or her engagement with communities very difficult. Right? So institutional spaces need to be opened up. So let me end by reading just this. Right? Engaged ethnography has great potential for political empowerment of both the scholar activist and the subaltern historian, as well as generating epistemologically complex ethnographic narratives towards collective political production of realistic utopias. For us to contribute in a way that matters to these collective utopias, for communities to own the data that we help generate and act on it, we must be political allies advocating the right to adequate housing, at least this particular issue. And as middle-class knowledge producers, we need to believe that the right to adequate housing for the poor is a critical aspect of generating inclusive and sustainable cities for all urban citizens. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chester, Dr. Arcelia, for again highlighting some of the key issues that you have to face when you are in the field and your own roles are changing and people's views are changing and so on. Well, I think there have been many interesting developments proposed, but it's clear from these two examples that probably represent many struggles now that people are facing in the field, that every issue is really a political issue. And so where do you fit? I think the big change in anthropology has been that the early anthropologists all studied other countries, other cultures. So they really couldn't get involved unless they were in the colonial administration, maybe. But there was a separation. They were really the other. But when you're an anthropologist in your own society and you have your own values about social justice, equality, and so on, it's very hard to stand back and say, well, I can't be involved in that, etc. So, and then if you're in a university, as I think your article also points out, that also constrains you because often they're not oriented that way completely. All right, so I think with all of these issues, we have in the audience social development workers, social scientists, government people, and so I would like to open, I have to start my video, yes. Yes, so let me open the floor for comments or questions, and I'll ask Dr. Caraos if she would kind of take over the discussion of questions and comments that can be raised. So
yes, yes, thank you, Professor. I have two questions for both panelists. One from someone in the meeting room, and the other was from the Facebook. They're both asking a question in the, I guess, in the context of our COVID situation. The first is, how do you sustain engagement, establish field relations amidst restricted mobility and urgent survival questions on the ground that certainly need to come first before research? And the other question, wait, let me. Okay, the other question from FB. I just wonder how these ethical considerations will go in urban ethnography and participatory studies conducted in the time of COVID-19, which is expected to last for a couple of years and even more. I can't help foreseeing an evolving role of the ethnographer here, and perhaps coupled with emergent research methods and strategies in the recent years and years to come. So who would like to respond to those two questions first?
Maybe I'll answer first.
Okay.
Regarding the first question, well, both of them are dealing with a COVID scenario. And I think for the first one, how do we sustain our relationship, our engagement with the community with regard to our lesser mobility these days? I think this is where the value of ethnography, the pre-established relationship you've had with the community comes in. Because if you've already have established that rapport, if you have established that relationship prior to this COVID scenario, it's quite manageable to still stay connected. In my case, as I've mentioned, every day I get updates from Baseco Compound, from my community partners. Since they lack resources, initially what I do is that I give some data load for the person who manages their Facebook. And then I tell her like, okay, she did not even ask for it. I just said, you know what? I feel bad that you just keep on sending me pictures from the field and telling me stories about the field, how you guys are doing. Let me give you some data allowance so that you could keep on chatting with me. And so that in that way, I was able to stay connected with them, know what they need, know where I could help them during this time of COVID. And it's very important that we maintain those, because we're not in the time of Malinowski or our ancient anthropologists that it's hard to go back to your community and ask them how they are. We have technology these days, so it's easier. Our collaborators are active in Facebook, so we could chat with them. For the second part, the question raised about how do what was that? Sorry. Active participation, was it? No. Anyway, for the second part, my response to that is this is why it's very important that we have institutional collaborations. I'd like to highlight a recent collaborative work that I've done with several communities for a short study requested by the Department of Health. In fact, Professor Mary was consulted for that. And so what we had to do was, since I cannot go and establish new field sites to gather this data, I asked the University of Santo Tomas, Simbahayan, which is the community development arm of UST, if they could help me if they could help me, if they could link me to their communities, and ask them if and ask the community leaders if they would be willing to participate in a short inquiry by the Department of Health that will affect their lives in the long run. And so it became a voluntary involvement. They were not forced at all. And I think this was a good example of how at this time that we are so limited by the pandemic, that we could still connect with communities, and we could still gather information that could help us as researchers and help them as well as a community. So institutional support, and at the same time, the value of ethnography. Thank you.
Dr. Chester, would you like to add something to that?
Just really
question?
short, right? So the COVID is very challenging for us as researchers.
Can you speak louder, please?
Yeah, sorry. So the COVID is making ethnography very challenging for us researchers. I really wanted to go to the field and ask how people are and see for myself what's happening on the ground. But like what Carinnes said, you have to rely on pre-existing relationships, right? So like her, I receive information on what's happening in the community. I get consulted more or less on current development, demolition threats, and what I think needs to be done, right? So we set up meetings, although not in very highly dense places, to talk about what can be done and what community can do. So I maintain my relationships with the community, but we need to be really creative, and we need to maximize online, Facebook groups, cell phones, internets, although we also need to recognize that these are really requiring a certain material, leisure, right? So some level of material, financing, right? So Carinnes' suggestion of sharing our resources, if there is resource from both the personal level and at the community level, is very important, sustaining the communication with grassroots communities at this time.
Okay, I think, Jean, you have another set of questions?
Yes, there are two more questions for Dr. Arcelia on 2 points that you made in your presentation. One is asking, did being seen as an insider or as trusted by Kadamay alienate you then from the less radical members of San Roque? How do you then account for the implied non-inclusiveness of firming up your positionality as engaged anthropologist? And the second question is, your insight on opening institutional spaces such as universities to the poor so they can have access to knowledge is interesting. Can you share an example how to operationalize this?
Right. Okay. So the answer to the first question is that given the different politics that exist for urban poor groups within a particular community, did it alienate me in a sense from other less radical groups? And the answer is yes, right? So reaching out to these groups is very difficult once you're being labeled as somebody that's very radical, right? So, but on the one end, it allowed me to access very deep information from the side of Kadamay and radical groups. I understood how they thought about things, how they draw upon existing strategies of why they do community barricades, right? At the same time, however, I tried my best to reach out to the other groups and offering help in terms of data access, right? So you navigate your position, and in a way, sometimes you play around with multiple identities, right? You present yourself as an activist to those who are willing to accept you as an activist. You present yourself as a professor for those who are viewing you as somebody important in terms of the resources you bring as a professor. You present yourself as a scholar that's enrolled in a foreign university in accessing data from government institutions. So you have to play around with these multiple identities in order to access different knowledges and different realities, because those realities may not agree with each other, and these political groups may not agree with each other. But at the end of it, what you get is a much more complex story rather than focusing on a particular case study. right? So you get a much more complex story of what's happening on the ground, why people are sometimes one of the political questions that's often asked of the urban poor. Why can't the urban poor simply get their act together and act like a class and defend their interest? If they did that, their struggles are not so difficult because they're really a majority of the urban citizens, right? But when you go down on the ground, it's not very easy because cultures are different. They come from different regions. They share they have different religions. And politically, the divide in the urban poor politics is very deep, and it goes all the way to influences within the larger left movement and the people who went out of that movement and had now engaged the openings after the EDSA and so on and so forth. So much more deeper discussion, but uh, we struggle on the ground and it's not easy. I think the question doesn't just apply to radical scholars. It also applies to people who deal with less radical groups because in turn they privilege a particular less radical story that comes from the urban poor and they miss out on the radical stories, right? For instance, the Occupy Bulacan that was done by Kadamay cannot be explained simply by looking at Occupy Bulacan. You have to trace the history of that within urban poor communities beyond Bulacan because the organizers did not come from Pandi. They came from other groups, other slum communities, right? So that story is going to be missed out by less radical scholars. So the question is really applicable to any one of us that tends to think about realities as homogeneous, right? So we need to be careful about using case studies, right? Because these case studies refer to a particular group and their social experiences, but communities may be much more complex than what these case studies will present. Right? Now, the other question about institutional opening up institutional spaces, this is not very easy, as Ma'am Mary would attest, right? Opening up spaces for the urban poor in a way that's sustainable and accountable is not very easy. It's very good that UST has that space, right? So what I did in my own little space was initiate the first a group that discusses urban poor issues. It's a group of scholars with grassroots leaders, and we would meet together to talk about issues so that the scholars would learn from the experiences of the grassroots leaders, and the grassroots leaders would learn from the way scholars would try to understand these things. The other thing is I developed an elective in my development studies department that focuses on slums and southern cities. What are the issues that are often faced by slum dwellers in southern cities? And this is a way to introduce a larger number of students to both the topic and the research methodology. So we partner with communities. I was planning to partner with Baseco because it was nearer to UP Manila, right? But the COVID happened, and so Corinne and I need to talk about that out after the meeting.
Yeah, I don't know if Corinne, if you would like to add to that, although you don't have to. No. All right. Jean, there's one on the anti-terror bill. Maybe you can pick that one up.
Yeah, there's one on the anti-terror. How do we keep ourselves and our informants safe when we do research amidst the anti-terror law? I saw in your presentation that you have deep engagements even with the radical groups. How do you reconcile ethical engagement in knowledge production vis-a-vis the danger of the new anti-terror law that can endanger informants and critical social scientists? I guess that question can be addressed to both panelists. And another one, what if the participants or collaborators are willing to share more than what is prescribed by the ethics committee? I guess this refers to the ethics committee of universities. Is that ethical enough to include on the reports?
Corinne?
Okay. I am very, very careful with my engagement with communities and being red tagged because it's just as Dr. Arcilla mentioned, it's just really a very difficult process to navigate once you get red tagged. And we've known so many academics who've been tagged like that. So anyway, in my case, because Baseco is a very volatile area that is also subjected to a lot of political issues with regard to land as well. What I do to just lessen that tagging incident is by joining with the local barangay in my work with them. So before, what I usually do, especially when I bring in students inside Baseco, what I do is that I introduce them to the the health leader. What's that? The kagawad who's handling health, because most of our researches are on health. So I let them meet the kagawad, introduce to them. And I like how Dr. Arcilla mentioned a while ago that sometimes you just have to really shift your identity just to make sure that things go on in the research process. So when I'm speaking with the barangay tanots, barangay officials, I'm suddenly this faculty member from UST who's, you know, very holy and whatnot. But the moment I go back to the field, that's a different story. So it's very important to really negotiate your identity when you're in the field, because what you don't want is to start a research project with you being labeled with a whole lot more. But I totally understand that some of our colleagues cannot avoid that because of the nature of their research. It's just, I guess, in my case, it's a bit easier to navigate that issue because we're on health. We're not necessarily, I mean, we're on health, so we have that pad to, although we work for issues of displacement and such, but since we have health as a primary topic, it becomes what they focus on immediately. So now, that being said, I think the anti-terror law will have an impact on researches like mine and Dr. Arcelia, because the moment you work with people in the margins, you're immediately tagged as a communist, rebel, and what. I sometimes joke about it, but I know it's not a point of joke, but it's, you know, it's something that we have to face now as academics. And we just have to find institutional means to guard ourselves and protect ourselves from that scenario.
Okay, right. Let me answer the second question first. So we need to listen to people's stories, even though they're outside the parameters of ethical committees. Right? Because listening to other people's stories is really a way to recognize that their situations exist. And it's very empowering for people to tell us their stories, right? It's very validating that these realities exist, right? And for somebody, an outsider, often viewed as somebody from a position of power, a university professor, listening to their stories, that's very empowering for the communities, right? So we need to listen to the stories. Now, whether or not these stories go into our reports is another matter, right? I think the most reliable for me, of course, there are safeguards within scholarships that you tend to take away any information that will associate the place or the identity of your participants, so that you minimize the risk. But one of the things that we can do is really make the decision collective, right? We need to involve the grassroots in the decision of whether they want their stories or what part of their stories can be publicized, right? So we need to be talking to them, right? So which part of these stories do you think is important that the public hears, right? And which part of these details need not be said, right? Now, the anti-terror bill puts us in a really difficult situation. The other day, 4 members of Kadamay in the occupied Pandi housing were arrested because in the morning they took pictures of themselves in selfies that they were demanding additional funding assistance from government because of the poverty they were experiencing because of the pandemic, right? In the afternoon, while they were already doing their laundry or cooking, they were arrested, and they are now, with the Bulacan police, right? And I'm not sure whether the lawyers have had access to them and their friends and their families had access to them since yesterday, right? So with that being said, let me also say that the responsibility of protecting our respondents doesn't rely solely on us. Communities can actually also protect us and themselves, right? There's a communities are aware of the risks sometimes that they face, particularly activists, right? And sometimes they may be in a better position to actually protect us as scholars who are sympathetic to these groups, right? So again, I go back to my earlier response. It has to be a collective decision. We need to involve our friends, grassroots leaders, grassroots communities, and explain the situation. And together we can create a much more safer environment for research to continue. But research needs to continue because people need to listen to these stories. While it may be much more difficult now with the anti-terror bill, we need to continue our work.
Okay, I have two interesting questions which touch on a theme that Carinnes underscored in her presentation. This has to do with power dynamics. So one of the questions asks, I wonder, how do you navigate possible processes that would indirectly engender relationship of dependencies? That is, communities becoming reliant on scholars for resources, and also possibly avoid reinforcing the neoliberal independent self. The other question talks of symbolic violence. How do you start building trust and maintaining relationships with the members of a community? It can be either San Roque or Baseco, when you're already coming from a position of authority as an academic to begin with. Avoiding committing symbolic violence in the process of immersing in the community feels so much easier said than done. And I just don't know where to start as a university student coming from a place of relative privilege.
So we can never, it will be quite naive to say that we go to the community without power with us, because we come from a point of privilege. The mere fact that you're going to another place to study their life ways is already a privilege, because you have time to do that, you have resources to do that. Now, how do we temper that? You're right, it's easier said than done, and that's the reason why I think Chester and I share the same issue, that we finished our researches quite long, because it was so hard to just write about it and at the same time navigate these relationships and make sure that in that process you actually deal with the issue of power dynamics. So how I think in my discussion I've already highlighted how I did that in my work. Apart from daily considerations, daily emphasis that although I'm from the university, I'd like to partner with you in producing this knowledge. Simple ways by that I've done it is by after recording our conversation and transcribing it, I show it to them and say, do you think this is accurate? Do you think which part of this do you think I should remove, or how do you feel if I write about these things? And I think at that moment you actually begin to lessen that power dynamics, because at that moment you recognize that, yep, although I'm the one recording, documenting your life ways or your experiences, I am also very much reliant on your meaning making process for me to make sense of what happened. So that's my answer for that other question. And for the question on dependency, now I think that is still something. I think I mentioned that's still something that I am burdened with, and that's why one of my slides said, are we really breaking free? Because you still ask me if it's okay to have a feeding program, even if you have your own organization now, you have your own money. But I think it will take some time, because it's a reality that we have to face when we get into the community with all the resources that they know we have. there is already this immediate idea that maybe this person can help us change something in the community. It's a given, and that's what my collaborators told me when they first met me. They kind of thought that maybe I'll be just like one of those missionaries who came to the community and provided them with some resources, just that I don't preach God or something. So I think it takes a while to totally dismantle that power dynamics and dependency, but we can do that consciously. Even if I want, for example, there was sorry I'm belaboring this point, but for example, there was one incident that they had like conflict in the group, and instead of resolving that immediately amongst themselves, they had to call me, use the load. And you're not supposed to use that load because it's, crucial resource. They called me and said, "Ma'am, we are having a fight, and this is what's going on. And can you help us resolve it? Can you tell them?" I said, "No, I'm not gonna resolve this for you. You are an organization. You have to decide on your own. You have to talk it out as a group and decide how you're going to move forward with this." And I have been doing this consistently for about a few months now, because since they've started their own group, it's a way for me to remind them that you should be in charge of your aspirations. You should be in charge of your voices. You should be in charge of governing how you want to go forward as a unit. So I think that's, in simple ways like that, we could somehow cut this dependency predisposition towards the academic and the community that they work with.
Dr. Arcilla?
Yeah, actually being aware of our capacity for symbolic violence is a very good step. So whoever asked that question, right, you're on your way to becoming a really engaged ethnographer, right? So we don't need to deny our difference with communities, because we come from a different social position. We're middle class, we occupy a position in universities, our families are well off, and so on and so forth, right? But I think to sum up is, we need to be their friend, right? When I think about these things, I simply think about, what would I do if the community is my friend, right? So part of being friends with the marginalized is really to unlearn privilege, right? We need to unlearn the way we have seen things, the way we smell things, the way we touch things, right? We need to unlearn a lot of our behaviors, right, in order to become their friend, right? So I remember I began feeling at home with the activists when I became a butt of jokes, right? Sabihin, pinagtatawanan na nila ako, right? I remember that was really inspiring for me. Finally, I was one of them, because I was, no matter my position, they still called me professor or prop, right? But they were making me a butt of their jokes. And so that was very interesting. But beyond that, for a lot of marginalized communities, we need to share their risk and their struggles, right? For us to be viewed as part of them, and us to minimize our symbolic violence, we need to share their risk and their struggles, right? So whatever form that you can actually contribute is very welcome for communities, right? Now, the sense of dependency is a very real issue when you work with grassroots communities, but that changes when you begin to work with organized groups. Organized groups are very much aware that they're very empowered, and they know the limits and their capacities. They know they can ask for help, but they can also know that people have limits in terms of resources, right? So working with individual families is different. You may be, pwede kang maging ninong, ninang, and so on and so forth, right? But when you deal with organized groups, right, the sense of dependency is not very much a problem anymore, because the leaders themselves would correct their members that these things are not permissible, right? So, yeah, that's it.
Okay, there are a few more questions, but I think some of them have already been answered in a way, and we are running out of time. We have another session coming up with a student. So I'm turning over the floor to Mary for an example. I mean, she's going to share a martial law example. Mary, you're muted.
Yeah, I must say I can't resist, even though I really am not supposed to be a presenter, but you know, the discussion of the anti-terror law takes me back to what should we learn from the past. And during martial law, I was very active with NGOs who were working in the Tondo foreshore. And one of the top leaders of the communities of Soto, Zone 1 organization, was arrested by the military. And there she was, and that of course created terrible big worries among NGOs, well, the community as a whole, because now she's a prisoner of the military. Okay, then two of us who were on the board of PECO, which was the organization that was supporting the organizing of Soto at the time, got phone calls from the human rights lawyers, Senator Diokno and Tañada, who invited Tessie Palacios, who was a social worker teaching at UP, and me to see them urgently. So we didn't know what that was. What we went, and they said, you know, Trini has been arrested. We need a statement as to why community organizing is not a communist strategy. Oh, right. And you two are university people, you write, and you're advocates. Can you please write a statement for us as the human rights lawyers that we can present to the military court of what is community organizing? Because they were accusing her of being a communist because she was leader of a community organization. So the two of us were petrified. And they said, you can think about it, but we need your answer fast. So the two of us talked to each other. We were saying, this is terrifying. What if we write this and it's submitted and they know it's us, the next thing, we're going to get arrested. And what about our family? Number one, we were both married, we both had children. Our husbands had no idea we were that involved in the community. So that was already one issue. And the dangers of what happens to your children if you also get arrested and so on. Well, so we decided we really have no choice. If we're really committed, this is the time they have asked us to do the only thing we're the only two who could do that particular need. All right, there were many others who were great on the board of PECO, but we were the only two who were academics. So we said to each other, either we do this or we can never go back to the community, right? Because when the time of truth came, that our singular talent was asked for, we didn't come through. So we have to take the risk. And we decided, we had no idea. And we each packed our little bag. It was we each hid it so our husbands didn't see it. But each day we would be terrified if there's a car that stopped outside your house at 2 a.m, you wake up and you're terrified because that was the context of martial law. And so it was submitted, it was discussed in the military tribunal, and well, I won't go into all the details, but that was where you have to know how far will you go on a risk and what does it mean? You know, if you don't take that risk because you were asked by them to do it, who are you? Where do you identify? Then, as we had said, we will never go back to Tondo. We'll stop this because it's just a pretense. When the time of truth came, we didn't respond. So we did. Fortunately, we didn't get arrested. And after about 2 weeks, we put away our toothbrush and extra underwear and clothing and went back to the community. So that's an example what things that you never thought would face you as an academic, because what you're doing is good, right? And so on. You discover other people have different understandings of it. And with an anti-terror law, of course, that adds to the problem. And so on that happy note, I should say, let me say thank you to our two presenters, to the people who raised some of these important issues, regretting those people whom we couldn't accommodate, but at least we know that these issues are now on the front burner. And we thank very much also Dr. Corrales and Dr. Melis and Navarra and Kaloy there for being in the background, make all of this happen. So to all of you, thank you. And our participants, particularly Dr. Arcilla and Carinnes, for being the kinds of academics that we hope our students see as role models for them in the future, plus many out there. So thank you. I think that ends the session.
Yes.